Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Keep Your Mind in Tune, episode number 4. Today, we are 1 week away from the presidential election. We're going to be talking about healthcare. We're going to be taking a deep dive, looking at the history, all the way through the present, and looking to the future of what might be in store for this country. It's a complex issue, and we have some amazing guests here speaking with us about it. First, I'm going to have a conversation with Jerry Harrison of Talking Heads. Some of you may know that Turkuaz was about to embark on a tour with Jerry Harrison and Adrian Belew, playing the music of Talking Heads for Remain in Light's 40th anniversary, just before the pandemic hit. And we do, of course, plan to resume once live music starts to take place again and on a regular basis and things return to normal or close to normal. But Jerry has some really good insight on the history of healthcare in this country. And then joining us afterward, Mr. Karl Denson, who you may know from Karl Denson's Tiny Universe, also currently plays with Rolling Stones and has played for Lenny Kravitz, Steve Winwood, among many, many other people, too many to name. He will join Kunj and I for a conversation with BU Professor Nicole Huberfield, who focuses on health law, and that is an extremely in-depth but interesting interview. And I know some of these interviews, by some I mean all, are a little long, and we go deep on these subjects, and we hope that you'll stick with it if you're interested in the subject matter, because it really is worthwhile. And we're trying to get away from headlines and 2-minute segments on news programs that are trying to sum up these extremely complex issues. And part of our goal here is to give some nuance and some depth to these topics, which truly deserve it. So without any further ado, here is my talk with Jerry Harrison of Talking Heads. Now we are here with Mr. Jerry Harrison. I think everybody knows who Jerry is who's watching this show, but of course from Talking Heads, and Turkuaz was honored to be selected to join Jerry to do some Talking Heads music that unfortunately we did not get to do. Welcome, Jerry.
Well, it's nice to be with you, Dave, and hopefully next year or whatever we can do it, we'll be able to go back to that project.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the plan for all of us. We get inquiries quite regularly, and yes, we are fully planning to resume as planned whenever possible. And today we're talking about healthcare, not specific to the pandemic necessarily, but obviously that is part of what unfortunately has taken musicians off the road is perhaps some sort of lack of infrastructure for healthcare in the whole country. And I think you are quite familiar with the history of this, Jerry, as well as I know you're in various businesses that are involved in the healthcare world. So,
well, I do. We were, you and I were having a conversation earlier today, and as I understand it, the reason the United States is sort of unique in its company approach to healthcare rather than a nationwide approach comes from the politics following World War II, where we were the only industrialized country whose infrastructure hadn't been severely damaged by World War II. And particularly in Europe, but I think this is probably true in Japan, the sense was that there needed to be some kind of nationwide system because what it had provided security in the past system, those companies no longer existed, or they were so damaged, and it was going to take years before they could be back. And as well as the fact that there was the sort of war of ideas between communism and, we'll say, the Western moderate state, as Stanley Hoffman would call it. And not always so moderate, as we know. But, and prior to World War I, one of the main reasons that fascism was sometimes embraced was the fear of communism. But the communists were pretty pretty prevalent in France and Italy in particular. And so you had the communists on the one side, and then you had rightist parties that were trying very hard not to seem like the parties that had preceded them, that were the fascist parties. And usually the Christian Democrats were the coming down the middle. And healthcare was something that they could kind of all agree on, is that, well, the state should take this on. The United States, I think, looked into this, and then the auto industry was so powerful, which had, of course, had converted and powered the war effort. And I mean, you look at the factories in Detroit, the speed with which tanks rolled off the assembly line, and out west, and airplanes.
Yeah, they ceased production on vehicles, right? And they started
They switched over. And I mean, one of the things that the Japanese couldn't believe was we had this great advantage that we had this electric power, like at the Grand Coulee Dam, so that we could make aluminum. And that allowed us to produce planes. The Japanese planes were part wood and aluminum. And wow. They just, when they were shot down, the pipeline was slow, whereas the United States seemed to have an inexhaustible, not very often, not as well designed as the planes by the Luftwaffe and the Japanese until later in the war, when we kind of overtook them. But we overwhelmed them with numbers. But so anyway, this same manufacturing base, and I think there were actually meetings by the head of the United Auto Workers and GM and Ford and Chrysler saying, why don't we take over healthcare? And we can do, as companies were able to provide better healthcare, and they saw it as a way that they could then get the best workers for their industries. And the workers who were in those industries, who, those union memberships were of the sort of organized part of labor, were a large portion. They thought, we're going to get better healthcare than we would under a national system. And so we got down this route of company-based, and you might say union negotiated company. But of course, we've seen the union population in the United States shrink dramatically, particularly starting around the time of Reagan, where he broke the air traffic control union by saying, by bringing in military air traffic control. And so the anti-union movement and the right to work states and all of these things has, created that whatever power there was to, that was resided in the union has gotten smaller and smaller. But it's also created this problem, is that a lot of union members have given up wage increases in the United States to have decent health care guaranteed by the companies they work for. Right. So they don't want that undone by national health care. And so it creates this sort of, and we talk about Obamacare and the successes of it, but, to me, it's kind of a pig in the poke.
Yeah, it's a flawed,
it's a very,
plan.
And interestingly, like Richard Nixon offered a national health care plan that was so much better than Obamacare and much more complete. Mm-hmm. But of course, the Democrats thought they could get a better one and didn't take it.
Isn't that the story? And here we are again. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this goes on and on. I do think that the pandemic has certainly lessened the argument that that for the majority of Americans all is well, because so many people, when they were laid off their jobs, suddenly their health care was compromised
in the midst of a healthcare
crisis. In the midst of a healthcare crisis, and so the argument for a more nationalized system became far stronger. Yeah. And I've always thought that there's a really great, you might say, libertarian argument for national health care. And it would go like this, is that in comparison to other countries, one of the strengths and, you might say, weaknesses and brutality of the American system is the idea of the acceptance of failure of companies and bankruptcy. And So companies, we have far more companies are started in this country because there is this sort of climate that says, you have an idea, try it. And if it fails, well, it failed. And there may be 4 people trying to do it and 1 succeeds. Well, that's the way our system works. And so the portability of your healthcare system and frankly, your pension plan would add to that dynamic, because you now have people not leaving jobs because they don't know what kind of healthcare they would get if they went someplace else, and sort of unhappily staying at a job or not challenging themselves to look for something more challenging or better. And you have companies that are also stagnant. You have companies that are only, trying to hire 3 part-time workers instead of a full-time worker because the benefits packages, they can avoid them. And I think that that's a skew, I think that, it's a little bit like skewed markets are bad markets. And so there would be something far purer is that anytime someone is hired, a certain, sort of like Social Security, there would be an amount that goes towards maybe health and welfare, and that's what companies do. And it's not run by a private group, and it's run there. And I also think that, we also see, I was just talking to, I've come here to Chicago where I've met a lot of doctors at Northwestern, and they were saying is that a lot of the best hospitals is that the people on Obamacare can't get into them. They just don't take them. The doctors don't take them in their practices, and they get second-rate service anyway. And having been in Italy and my wife flown by helicopter to the city hospital of Naples, I fortunately got her to the NATO hospital, but it was, there were 2 healthcare systems there. There was the public one, and then there was the private one.
Right.
And so, if we end up having a universal healthcare, we will have a private one on top of that. And already the HMOs and Medicare, the amount of time doctors can spend with a patient, especially in the, is so, they have to see 45 patients a day, and they have to only do 15 minutes with each patient. And so it makes the care worse. And I know a lot of doctors that just go, you just got to pay me cash. I just can't stand that anymore. I don't care what kind of insurance you have. You can have that for when you get hit by a car, but like for now. And so we have a sort of broken system. And I don't think any of these things is going to fix it 100%. But there's an awful lot of things that a coordinated system, and I think that if you look at the studies that were done at the time of, even going back to when Hillary Clinton was trying to put this together, of the differences between the Canadian, the English, the Swiss, the French, and the German systems. The Swiss and the German systems and the Dutch are far more public-private partnerships, where some of the others are far more just a public system, with then usually a private one. Like if you want to get a hip transplant, or you
want to opt into a higher quality.
You get it quicker. You get it more quickly.
England is pretty much entirely government run, though. Is that correct?
It's government run, but people often, I think, have an overlay if they have the wealth to be on top of that to speed a process.
Right.
And I think there are doctors that only work privately there too.
Right.
And they also say that, if everything was Medicare for all, Medicare is subsidized by private insurance in the United States, because the hospitals and the doctors would not survive only on Medicare. One of the things that's happened during the pandemic is all those hospitals that have had to stop doing elective surgeries are going out of business. We're going to have a lot of hospital systems shutting down all across the country just when we need them.
That's where their margins were coming from, right?
Because that's where they were able to make up what they lost on, you might say, public care. And now if it's all public care, they're going bust. And
right. If there's not a system in place to compensate them properly for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's there, we unfortunately, and, I know that there was a friend of mine had gone to I paid a lot of money as a donator to Barack Obama, and he went to a dinner where Barack Obama said, like, if I was starting from scratch, I would definitely do a public system, but I don't want to have suddenly to say, well, these 500,000 people are going to be out of a job next week because we've transitioned to this other system.
And exactly, we started at we're kind of working from where we started. We don't have the ability to start from scratch, which is frustrating because that's what like you said, so many countries kind of did after World War II, and we just didn't go that route.
Well, it's almost the same thing as happens in computers. It's like one of the things that why was the PC more hackable than the Mac? Because they had to support all of these computers that went way back in time. And so they had these kind of fixes that created holes in the operating system and made them more porous.
Right.
And, again, it's this attempt to sort of patch something that doesn't work particularly well. And sometimes, and of course that's that's always when a older industry or an older company gets displaced by a younger, more agile one. It's usually because the younger one can start with a new paradigm that maybe is much more efficient or takes much less work.
Right.
Runs on a new computer that's much faster. So therefore, it's just in the end becomes much more efficient.
Yep.
I do think, though, that there's lots of things that are simple that could be done. Like there should be a universal for people's records. There should be a universal way that they are private, but also kept in a way so that you don't have to, every time you get to a doctor, you're filling out this paperwork that just should be already there.
Yeah, I think about that.
That should have been the first thing. It's like, let's come up with a universal standard between the healthcare systems and Medicare and say, that's it. This is what it is. Everyone uses the same thing.
Well, you certainly have a wealth of knowledge on this subject. Maybe we'll check in again. We got to do another one of these, and we'll check in again as things unfold over the coming months. And
I look forward to it. Okay.
Thank you.
All your listeners, keep on listening to Dave. You'll be easy. Okay.
Thanks for vouching for me. I appreciate it.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon, man. Later.
Okay.
All right. We've got an incredible interview coming up, but first, here is one song from our Bonnaroo performance, Turkuaz, featuring Jerry Harrison and Adrian Belew. This is Houses in Motion. Enjoy.
I felt without style and grace, wearing shoes with no socks in cold weather. I knew my heart was in the right place. I knew I'd be able to do these things. And as we watch him digging his own grave, it's important to know just where he's at. You'll keep on digging to the center of the earth. You'll keep on digging for 1,000 years.
I'm walking around, I'm thinking about empty motion. I'm walking around, just steady enough to believe in. Get out of the way.
No time to begin.
This isn't the time.
So nothing was done.
Not talking about.
Not ready at all.
I'm turning around.
No trouble at all.
You'll notice there's nothing around you. I'm walking around. Till find is all.
Never get to say much. Never get to talk. Tell us a little bit, but not too much. But right about then is where she gave up. She has closed her eyes. She has given up hope.
I'm walking around. I hate to be dreaming in motion. I'm walking around.
myself around. I'm walking backwards and forwards. I'm moving twice as fast as I was before. I'll be down in there, in the center of the earth. I'll be down in there, moving to the center of the moon.
I'm walking the line. I'm visiting houses in motion. I'm walking the line, just barely enough to believe it. Get out of the way.
No time to begin,
This is the time.
so nothing was done.
I'm talking about.
Not ready at all,
I'm turning around.
no trouble at all.
I'm giving my fingers behind me. I'm walking the line, divided his own.
All right, everybody. We are here once again with Mr. Kunj Shah and also Mr. Karl Denson. Karl, thank you so much for joining us here. I am Dave Brandwein, and joining us today to discuss some issues surrounding healthcare is Professor Nicole Huberfield from Boston University. And Nicole, I understand that you're a professor of health law, ethics, and human rights at the Belew School of Public Health. So you actually do work in the sort of intersection between where healthcare meets law, which is certainly quite relevant these days. Maybe more than ever before, especially these last 8 or 12 years or so.
It's definitely been busy.
I'm sure. And everything up in the air with ACA right now. And what is a lot of your teaching and research surrounding the recent, Obamacare, as it was called, or the ACA, and how that's been unfolding and been challenged since, or does a lot of this stuff go back way farther than that?
Oh, it's a great question. How long do we have? Since the ACA came into existence, it's basically been a permanent employment act for me and for many lawyers. I teach both at the School of Public Health and at the law school at BU. And so, as you said, my research is in both places. And the Affordable Care Act in particular created a sort of boom of new thinking in terms of where we are in health and healthcare in the United States. And in particular, I would say, now looking back on it, because we've just reached 10 years of the Affordable Care Act being a law in the United States, it seems like even though we've had all of this sort of political conflagration, right, it's such a hot potato, I do think that that conversation has made it so that people think more about what we expect in our health in the United States. And many polls seem to indicate that there is a desire for universal coverage and that many people expect the government to be involved in that. And that is really a big change. If you think about where we were in 2008 when President Obama was elected, the fact that the public option was a non-starter made it so that negotiating the Affordable Care Act was actually pretty limited in terms of what was possible. Everything had to be a piece of something that came before. And even though it feels like a long time ago, if you think about where we were in terms of the Democratic primaries this year, every candidate was advocating some kind of concrete plan for ensuring universal coverage. So that is really quite a lot of change in not a lot of time, at least in terms of how we move incrementally in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that is a big shift from this wasn't even on the table really. You know, maybe discussed a little bit when Mitt Romney was running because that had happened in Massachusetts, as you well know. But yeah, from the 8 years of Obama, and then especially with Bernie Sanders becoming such a prominent public figure and advocating so deeply that healthcare is a human right, and most, I mean, other civilized countries in the world do offer it in one way or another to all of its citizens. So yeah, although it is frustratingly slow moving at times, I guess public opinion has shifted on it rather quickly. The culture has kind of changed surrounding it.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, quick is relative, right? Given that
Right.
many nations adopted a universal approach to the right to health really after World War II. The United States, as an industrialized nation, right, as a wealthy nation, is certainly behind our peer nations. So let's be clear, this isn't that fast, but relative to the ACA, it's fairly fast.
So I don't want to swamp you with things that you may or may not know, but I have so many questions about this stuff because when my ex-wife, we have 3 kids, so we still have healthcare together, and she tended to lean a little more right through her life. I'm a former Republican, by the way, but I got rid of that baggage a while ago. But during the beginning of the Obama administration, and we started, building towards the ACA, and you hear all this talk, and just as a regular person paying a premium every month, it goes up, and you're kind of like, damn, I'm paying a lot for next to nothing when something actually happens, or my deductible is so high in order to keep the premium down and all this stuff. And then Obamacare comes along, and we're debating it, and she's getting this information from her friends over there on the right, and I'm getting my information, and we're trying to figure out what's the best way to do it. And the premiums keep going up every year. January 1st, it's like, this is gonna be your new premium. You're like, damn, again, and so just, and I've got tons of friends, like I said earlier, who have benefited from the ACA. But from your standpoint, as a person who's kind of been in the nuts and bolts of it, what are the pros and what are the cons of the ACA? If you could like do it so that we could go, okay, this is what we ended up with.
It's a great question. And I think you were not the only one to observe that cost is still a massive problem in the United States. So let me give sort of a landscape if I can. The Affordable Care Act, if it had one goal, if we had to say it was one thing, it would have been coverage. In other words, it was clear by the time of the 2008 election that in the United States, the rate of uninsurance was increasing steadily, in part because employers were actually providing health insurance as an employment benefit less and less since really the late 1980s. That was a consistent downward trend. And the people who were losing employer-sponsored coverage were not able to get it elsewhere. Many of them were not eligible for Medicaid because Medicaid only covered really less than half of the population. Medicaid before the ACA made it so you had to be poor and something else. So poor and a child, poor and a pregnant woman, poor and disabled, poor and elderly. If you were a childless, non-elderly adult, you couldn't get in. Likewise, the smaller insurance markets, commercial insurance markets, were not very functional. The individual insurance market, the small group market, they were very expensive. Insurers would say it's very difficult to actuarially evaluate how costly or risky a person or a small group of people will be. And so they would err on the side of charging quite a lot for those premiums. And so it made it so that people were either priced out of the market or just couldn't get in any dimension. So when the ACA was crafted, all the stakeholders were at the table, but the big goal was to make it so that coverage became universal or really near universal. Because I say near universal because non-citizens were excluded. Undocumented non-citizens were permanently excluded, and certain categories of lawful non-citizens had to wait about 5 years. So setting non-citizens to the side, otherwise, the goal was really universal coverage. And this was a massive change in terms of how we approach the healthcare non-system in the United States, because it really isn't a system. And the reason it was a massive change is that really the system had been a system of exclusion until that statute said, everybody gets in. We're going to make it so that these markets are more robust. We're going to make it so that Medicaid is expanded. So if you couldn't get into it before, all you need to do now is qualify by earning up to 138% of the federal poverty level. And there were sort of leveling rules put in place for the various commercial insurance markets that made it so that, for example, everyone's familiar with this one, pre-existing condition exclusions became illegal. Guaranteed reissuance of insurance became the standard. Lifetime caps were prohibited. So there were a number of practices that commercial insurers had engaged in regularly that were eliminated by the ACA. So a lot of the regulatory work of the ACA is getting everyone to be covered. And the reason is that in the United States, health insurance coverage is the gateway to consistent care. It doesn't guarantee access to care, but it is the most consistent gateway or doorway to consistent care. And so that's obviously a backwards way to think about it. If we were designing a system, we wouldn't ask first, how do you pay, right? How is the individual going to pay? Isn't the way you design a system. But right. We built on what came before, and that was what came before. So in fairness, that is the great strength of the ACA, is that its goal was to make a huge change in terms of getting everybody covered. However, really not much work was done to fix the cost problem in the United States. And some help was given to lower income people who earn less than 250% of the federal poverty level are much more likely to be uninsured. So if people are buying insurance through what people call the marketplace or the health insurance exchanges, and they earn 100% to 400% of the federal poverty level, they're eligible for federal tax credits to purchase small group or individual insurance. So those federal tax credits help people to pay their premiums to purchase insurance. And then if you earn less than 250% of the federal poverty level, you're also eligible for other cost sharing assistance from the federal government. So that dimension of affordability is addressed by the law in terms of trying to help the people who are the most likely to be uninsured, i.e. lower income people. That was addressed, but it didn't change the cost of insurance coverage or the cost of care. What it really did was provide a financial boost to people who couldn't otherwise afford the cost of insurance coverage. So you're absolutely right to observe that premiums are expensive. One thing people do is they opt for lower premiums, but higher deductibles. And that means you really have to have cash under your pillow for that moment when you or your family member gets sick. And that is really surprising to people who live in other wealthy nations. I encounter a fair number of international colleagues at Boston University, and when they learn from human resources how our health insurance plan works, they're universally stunned, because the cost of it, after you've paid a premium to get that annual contract with your insurance, right? You still have to have cash in pocket to pay your deductible and to pay co-payments to see specialists, and to, once you get past your annual wellness exam with your primary care physician. And you may have all of that happen at the end of the year, and then you start from scratch again the following year. So it's not even as if it has a cumulative benefit, because each year you're starting again at zero. And now for a family of four, the cost of insurance, the average cost of insurance for a family of four through employer-sponsored health insurance is around $20,000. You could get a small car for that amount of money. And that's just 1 year. You're not even getting something that lasts a while. So the cost issue is a huge issue. And before we were all diverted by coronavirus, much of the conversation coming into the presidential election was this question of cost and frustration with the outrageous cost of care in the United States. And so I would say, to answer your question, the pros of the ACA are the goal of universal coverage, which was disrupted slightly by the Supreme Court, and we can talk about that. We probably should talk about that. But the cons are that the costs remain quite high, and the cost curve has not been bent downward yet. The goal was to do that, but we really haven't gotten there. And in part, that's because the implementation of the Affordable Care Act has been disrupted in a couple of different ways. And in part, in the last couple of years, it's because the Trump administration has been openly hostile to the Affordable Care Act and has been undermining its implementation in a number of ways that have made it harder to achieve the goals of the law. So if you're someone who thinks that the ACA doesn't do much good for you, you may cheer those efforts on the part of the administration. But if you think that the goal of the ACA is important, i.e. universal coverage, then these moves, then there are a variety of different kinds of maneuvers, are quite damaging.
So I have health insurance, and I have health insurance through my wife's company. I also have a bone disease called the vascular necrosis, which is a rare bone disease, and treatments for it, experimental treatments for it include hyperbaric oxygen therapy, not included in insurance, comes up to $40,000. I had gotten stem cells in the Grand Cayman Islands because you can't grow stem cells in the United States for some reason, unless you're unless you're Regeneron and you're getting that to the president and whatnot. But my costs for my medical costs almost exceed my yearly salary, and then my deductibles and my copays are also extremely exorbitant. And I even wonder sometimes, what's the point of having insurance in the first place if it's deducting at $100 and I'm still getting charged $400? This system is not working for me in any way, shape, or form.
I think those are actually fairly common complaints. I'm not at all surprised. I'm sorry to hear what you're saying, but I'm not at all surprised by it. And it's because insurers, while they do have to cover 10 sort of essential benefits, there was a standardization of what insurers have to cover in order to be qualified health plans in the exchanges under the ACA. And so most insurers sort of follow that formula now of those 10 essential benefits. That doesn't necessarily mean they would have to cover a more unusual form of treatment. And of course, stem cell research is its own thing because there's such controversy over the use of fetal stem cells for stem cell research. And that is an area where there is no federal law pertaining to the use of fetal stem cells. It swings back and forth by executive order from administration to administration. So some presidents have allowed fetal stem cell research to progress, for example, with the National Institutes of Health and the things that they fund, but other presidents have decided for largely political reasons, i.e. to signal a culture of life, that they will not support fetal stem cell research. So you can get stem cells from adult cells, but they're not the same as fetal stem cells, which have the potential to be almost anything. And that stem cell research is what people think is potentially most promising, but also is the most restricted in most presidential administrations.
for religious reasons, I think largely, right? Or their
Yes.
voter-based religious.
Right.
It also sounds like a downside of the ACA is the complication, and people on the left, because of all that stuff you described, that's a lot of information, a lot of different things that affect. I mean, everyone is a unique case in a way. There's no like blanket treatment for people. And the single payer that has been pushed forward by the farther left, they say, yeah, we agree that this is not the best system. We think there should have been a single payer system. But do you think that the right, who really for some reason does not want the government to be responsible, I mean, the most extreme cases, responsible for people's health care at all, would they be even more critical of a single payer system, or would the lack of complication perhaps appease them and make them see over time, okay, this actually does work pretty well. This is what the rest of the world does.
I think it's actually very difficult to guess how people's minds might be changed. I do think that you can take some evidence from what's happened in the last 10 years with the Affordable Care Act, that people's expectations of the ability to have some kind of government assistance to get health insurance has certainly changed. And to your point that it's quite complex, that's the reason that the law actually required that navigators be used to help people purchase insurance. That's one of the features of the ACA that's been undermined by the Trump administration. They have cut the funding for navigators so that it's harder for people to actually navigate what it takes to purchase insurance. So even though under the law, there's this no wrong door concept that if you apply for private insurance in the exchange, but you're really qualified for Medicaid, then you'll get into Medicaid. It helps to have a person talking you through it. And that funding has been reduced for the federal exchange by the Trump administration. And in addition, open enrollment has been shortened by the Trump administration. By the way, open enrollment begins November 1st. So it's still a law and open enrollment will happen. So go do it on November 1st. Don't miss out. So your question, I think, goes to the point that it is quite complex, and the complexity is frustrating for everybody, regardless of whatever their political beliefs or ideology may be. But there is a really vast difference between how people who call themselves progressives and people who call themselves Republicans or conservatives think about this, because people who tend to be on the right, whether they're conservatives or libertarians, they tend to believe that government should have as little role as possible in healthcare and that markets will do the work. And people on the left have really, I think, largely given up on that approach, having seen decades of market failures. And they believe that it's time for government to do more. The ACA was that sort of push to say, okay, the government's going to fill in the gaps now because we're tired of waiting for the markets to do this work. I think that from a constitutional perspective, single payer health insurance sponsored by the federal government is actually quite straightforward. It is not difficult at all because it would be just a basic use of the spending power that Congress has to spend for the general welfare. So it would be constitutionally stable in the way that something like Medicare is, the federal program that people get when they turn 65. I don't think it's really a constitutional matter, frankly. I think it's more a matter of policy preferences and politics. And that those are much harder to negotiate, believe it or not. One would think the constitutional issue would be the difficult one, but it isn't in this case.
So so two questions. From the standpoint of if we were to, if the ACA was going smoothly, we were, integrating everyone into it, and would we be, and we're bringing the cost, we're figuring out the cost setup so that the cost was evening itself out, and people weren't feeling like they were getting ripped off when they actually used it. Would from a business standpoint, doctors, hospitals, and insurance companies, would there be a massive loss in their income? And secondly, to the question of, are premiums going up because of the ACA?
So your first question is, did the ACA make it, if the ACA were implemented as it was intended,
Mm-hmm.
would costs have come down? Is that your question? Or
Or would hospitals and doctors lose money? Right?
Yeah, would doctors make a lot less money? Would hospitals make a lot less money? Because that's part of the capitalist argument, of course.
I've heard that a lot.
yeah, so no. And so let's talk about what the ACA was meant to be for a minute. As I said, the Medicaid expansion was supposed to cover everybody who couldn't get into employer-sponsored insurance or couldn't purchase on the exchanges. And states challenged the constitutionality of Medicaid expansion, claiming that it was unconstitutionally coercive for Congress to require states to expand Medicaid with such a large category of people. The Supreme Court agreed in the 2012 decision called National Federation of Independent Business versus Sibelius, the first Supreme Court decision on the ACA. And what the Supreme Court held was that the requirement to expand Medicaid was unconstitutional, but the remedy was to allow states to choose whether to expand Medicaid or not. And over time, states have chosen to expand Medicaid. We're now at the point where 12 states still have not expanded Medicaid. They are some of the states with the highest uninsurance rates in the country, including Texas, Florida, and Georgia. They account for millions and millions of uninsured people. And because of this, we can see what it looks like to have the ACA operate as intended in some states, but not in others. And in the states where Medicaid expansion actually has been implemented as intended, there's more than 400 studies now showing the variety of benefits that come from having this full implementation of the ACA. And in particular, that foundational expansion of Medicaid as sort of the base of a pyramid of insurance options. I mean, really, employer-sponsored insurance is the base because most people, the slight majority of people, get their insurance through employer-sponsored coverage. But Medicaid expansion is actually a financial base in some ways because when people are not covered by any form of insurance, they are not costless in the system. They show up in the emergency department. Maybe it's someone who has asthma, but they're having respiratory distress. And so they show up for the care that they need in the emergency, but the asthma remains largely untreated. So we could be dealing with simple problems more efficiently, but rather because people don't have insurance, they don't seek things like primary care, and they wait until they have a really dire problem, and then they show up in the system. And states tend to have ways to pay for what we think of as charity care, i.e. care for people who are not covered. And the states have lost money on charity care. In other words, it's expensive for them to cover that. And so what we see in Medicaid expansion states is that it has actually been, if not budget neutral, budget positive for every state that has expanded Medicaid. In other words, this has been a stabilizing force for state budgets and also for the hospitals in Medicaid expansion states, and especially rural hospitals. If you were to look at a map of the rural hospitals that have closed in the last decade, almost all of them are in Medicaid non-expansion states. They're missing that form of financial support that is predictable. So even though Medicaid doesn't pay as well as commercial insurance and doesn't pay as well as Medicare, it is a form of predictable payment. And so if the law were implemented as designed, rather than post NFIB, states can opt out, what you would see is actually more financial stability in the healthcare industry. And I just can't see how people are arguing that healthcare providers would be losing money. It just doesn't add up for me based on the evidence. So the second part of your question, remind me what the second part of your question was?
I keep hearing this from the right that because of the ACA, that's why premiums have been going up even faster. Which my experience is not that. My premium has not been going up any faster than it was going up before Obamacare came into existence. But is that a complete fallacy?
That is not an evidence-based assertion. The evidence is that the ACA, initially premiums spiked a bit, and in the marketplaces in particular, people who were buying individual and small group plans experienced fairly high premiums because insurers didn't know how to key their pricing. And so they sort of overshot on what they thought it would cost to cover people in these newly robust insurance markets. But the premiums came down after that initial spike, and they've been relatively steady ever since. Honestly, the thing that has been destabilizing for commercial insurance has been Trump administration policies that have created uncertainty for enrollment for commercial insurers. So a couple of examples of that. Giving a regulatory positive policy note to short-term plans and saying that they're worth buying when in fact they're really largely junk insurance. Or when Congress enacted the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the end of 2017, zeroing out the penalty for failure to carry health insurance for the individual mandate. Some people took that as a signal that they didn't have to buy insurance. And the evidence so far is that most people are still buying insurance. But if people leave the markets, then premiums will go up because you have fewer people in the risk pool who are healthy and not using the insurance. That's how all insurance works. You can't buy auto insurance in the moment that you have a car crash. You can't buy homeowners insurance in the moment that your house catches on fire. Likewise, in healthcare, the goal is to not have people purchase in the moment that they get sick. And so if people leave when they're healthy, then they are affecting the risk pool and making it so that premiums would rise if they are waiting to purchase insurance until they know that they have a problem. So premiums have not gone up because of the ACA, but it is hard to say long-term what will happen with the zeroing out of that penalty for the individual mandate. The individual mandate is still part of the law, but the IRS has a $0 penalty for it. And that's actually what's before the Supreme Court next month on November 10th in California versus Texas.
Right.
I never thought of that. The fact that, to have a car, you need car insurance. To have a body, you should be able to have health insurance. And I just want to basically ask the same question Karl did about doctors, hospitals, and, insurances losing money, but not in the case of the ACA, but in the case of universal health care.
I was going to ask this because the person who told me that they have a client of theirs as a hospital and the people at the hospital were telling them, man, if this goes through, universal healthcare, the way Sanders was talking about it, we're done. We're screwed. And I thought that was the manufacturers and the drug companies that would get maybe less money, but not the hospitals and the doctors. But
my second question is, are these insurance companies' premiums that, you said that there was a spike, is there any regulation to that? Is the government regulating, the cost of how much these insurance companies are able to charge, their customers? Because I feel like that could also make a difference. I mean, if all of a sudden there's the ACA goes into effect and they all say, okay, well, let's raise our premiums so that, the population goes, this is horrible for us, let's get rid of it. Then that's one way to, kind of trick the population into thinking it's not for their best good. I come from a family of dentists, and they go back and forth on whether they think universal dental or healthcare would be beneficial or not beneficial for their practice. And they sometimes, most of the time, they go, well, more people will come in, and more people will get a lot of their issues checked out.
I'm going to take your second question first because it's the easier one to answer. So insurers that are qualified health plans have to abide by what are called medical loss ratios that were created by the ACA. And those medical loss ratios make it so that insurers have to spend a certain amount of the money that they make on actual medical costs, not on administrative costs, meaning paying CEOs and marketing. And so those medical loss ratios, to a degree, have the effect of regulating what's being charged. The ACA also requires what's called community rating, which means that everybody basically gets charged the same amount. So instead of saying, well, you have a unique medical problem, and so you're going to have a premium of $100,000 a year, but you look like a healthy white male, and so you're going to have a premium of $10,000 a year. Those practices are eliminated by insurers that comply with the ACA. So there are some rules about how insurers can determine their premiums. And they have to run their premiums, especially the insurers who sell in the marketplaces, they have to run their premiums by the government. So it's not so much the government sets the premiums, but rather has rules about how they get set. And so, there isn't straightforward regulation, but there is regulation of what insurance costs to a degree. Employer-sponsored insurance is different, especially for employers that have self-funded plans, meaning they create their own risk pool with their own money, which is what a lot of very large employers do. They tend to sit outside a lot of these rules, and they have sort of a different situation. So to your first question, what would happen if we actually had a universal public health insurance or public finance? That is a much harder question, because that is the work of health economists, and they come out in different places on this question. There are a lot of moving pieces that would have to be figured out to answer the question concretely. And you could look to things like back maybe late 2019, early 2020, Elizabeth Warren tried to come up with a financial plan for universal health insurance coverage. And it assumed some things that are probably good assumptions, but didn't really cover everything. So for example, right now, a lot of people don't realize that the federal government actually sponsors or subsidizes employer-sponsored insurance through tax benefits to the tune of about $200 billion in lost tax revenue every year. So
Can you repeat that?
you heard it, $200 billion in lost tax revenue every year.
The government pays for part of the employer's premiums that they cover.
They're not paying for it. Rather, what they do is give them tax relief. So it's lost tax revenue. So
we're paying for it.
So everybody's paying for it, right? So it is a hidden subsidy rather than the more overt subsidy of something like Medicaid or Medicare. And those kinds of hidden subsidies tend to be forgotten when people talk about what it would cost to have universal health insurance coverage. Because if we were to take that money and capture it, that could be turned into something that could fund the remaining 50% of the people who don't get public insurance. Because once you account for Medicaid, which covers nearly a quarter of the population, hovers somewhere around 23% of the population. Medicare covers somewhere around 20% of the population. The smaller federal programs like VA, Indian Health Service, right? And then you factor in what the subsidy is, right? There are some who calculate that the federal government is already funding, either directly or indirectly, at least 60% of health expenditures in the United States. But it's so inefficient that it's difficult to do a very straight accounting for how all of that occurs, in part because some of it is these sort of hidden tax subsidies. So you have to factor in those kinds of indirect methods of funding commercial insurance, employer-sponsored insurance that could be shifted to one concrete public insurance that is for everyone at birth to death, right? So it would be administratively simplified. Medicare and Medicaid are administratively less expensive than commercial insurance. Now they are run on a shoestring, so it's not to say that they do it exactly right either, because frankly, they could probably use some more people, but they have a significantly lower set of administrative costs, in part because they don't do things like all of the paying of very expensive CEOs and CFOs, and they don't do the things like, a lot of expensive marketing to make sure people buy that particular plan, right? Sure, the government engages in marketing, but not nearly to the same cost. So the administrative costs would arguably be lower. And you would be able to capture some of the money that shows up in other places to direct it to one particular sort of consolidated program. And then, of course, people like Elizabeth Warren tend to point to things like the fact that we don't actually do a very good job of collecting the taxes we're due. And if the IRS were to go after some of the known tax-paying shirkers, corporations that don't pay like they're supposed to, high-income people who don't pay like they're supposed to, you wouldn't really have to change the Internal Revenue Code, but rather just be better at collecting tax revenue that's due. Her point is we actually have ways to find the money and we're making choices not to do it.
I
So,
actually, I actually have a friend who's, at one of these. He just became, he just started working at one of the top law firms in New York City, and he was interested in joining the white collar crime division there. And they said, actually, for the past 4 years, we haven't really needed to defend any companies. The Trump administration's so pro-business that we actually don't need any more lawyers in this division because everything's just been so pro-business. But I also had a question about, countries like France. They're 77% funded, almost universal healthcare. And when I went to the Mayo Clinic to finally try to get some answers last year on my shoulder, and those are the best doctors apparently in the country, and he had one of the doctors had a fellow with him, and the fellow was from France. And I had asked the doctor, since my situation with my shoulder was so complicated, I asked him, if I were your son, what would you do? And he said, I would send you to this fellow's father in France and get you the pyrocarbon that's not yet approved by the FDA in France, and then bring you back here. And that's what I would do. So I know we're debating whether or not it's premiums are going to go up, or prices are going to go down, or how it's going to affect insurance companies, but it is working around the world, and their healthcare is arguably better. I'm still waiting on things to get approved here for my health that are approved in Europe and working 100 times better.
So there's a couple of things that you raised there. One is how American healthcare compares to other nations. And people like to say, oh, this is the best healthcare in the world. And I think the reason they say that is that we do have a remarkable amount of technological innovation that comes out of the United States. But a lot of the technological innovation is not available to most people because it is so expensive.
Yeah, they point out how celebrities and people from other countries come to the United States for treatment, so that just shows how great our system is. But like you said, those are the best of the best.
Yeah, it really doesn't speak to the system. What it speaks to is that if you have enough money, you can access almost anything. And that's true globally. So I don't know that that's unique in the United States. So we do have a lot of medical technology that and pharmaceuticals and other innovations that do occur in the United States, but that isn't the vast majority of the kind of care that most people need. Most people need care that is much more basic and common. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, for the amount of money we pay per capita, which is now, I think, around $20,000 per capita each year, is each person actually getting what they need in terms of their public health and their medical care, right? Because we need to look at both of those dimensions when we think about what it takes to make a person healthy. It isn't just individual medical care. It's also all of the things that surround you. It's your environment. It's a stable income. It's having food security. It's all of these, good education, right? All of those things affect whether a person is healthy, and we're falling down on those measures. So even though we're very good at medical innovation, we're not as great at the other things that make a basically healthy population. And other nations, frankly, have paid more attention to those kinds of public health questions and preventive care questions over time. A lot of people in the United States, I think, would be afraid of a system like the one that's in Great Britain. The National Health Service is true socialized medicine. The government owns the health care system, right? Healthcare providers are employed by the government. They're paid by the government. Canada is a little bit different. Canada is public insurance that looks sort of like our Medicare, and confusingly is also called Medicare. And so Canada doesn't have socialized medicine. What they have is social insurance. Their health insurance is sponsored by the federal government, and there is some variety between the provinces. And I believe France is structured somewhat similarly to how it's structured in Canada, unsurprisingly, because of course, there are colonial ties between the nations. So there are a number of ways to achieve what other nations have achieved. I don't think people should think that universal health insurance coverage is the only way to do it. I think the problem is that people are so frustrated with administrative complexity and cost that they want something that seems very simple. And that is the simplest possibility, probably. So I think that's why a lot of people.
That was the goal of the ACA, was to kind of like get to that point. Like I know we want to overcomplicate it and get there slowly, but if that's the goal and most of America's for it, why not take a stab at it? And if doctors and insurance company or doctors and hospitals start to lose money, can't we charge more? And I've heard this complaint from family members of mine. Oh, well, Medicaid pays so less. Well, why don't we have Medicaid pay the doctors more? There's a disparity. We are the government. We control the budgets. We can change what Medicaid pays out.
Yes. It's different with Medicare and with Medicaid for a key reason, actually. And I'm glad that you raised that point, right? Medicare actually has a quite complex algorithm for figuring out what it will pay any given healthcare provider for any given procedure, given how sick a person is, or what the severity of the illness is and how that will play out. And Medicare has regulatorily determined algorithms for figuring all of that out. And it gets administered on a regional basis by private insurance companies that contract with the federal government. So one thing I wanted to point out is that people think private insurance would have to go away, but in fact, private insurance has always had a role in Medicare. So if we wanted to keep private insurers in the game with a single payer system, it would be possible. We could look to Medicare for how that would look, right? Because private insurers actually administer Medicare on the ground. So Medicare is not usually the source of complaint. Most healthcare providers would say that Medicare pays decently. Sometimes it pays more than commercial insurance, sometimes it pays less, or it depends on what you're talking about. Medicaid, the program for people who are low income, is different because Medicaid is actually a joint program between the federal government and the states. So states actually set what they pay. And the standard in Medicaid is quite flabby. The standard is that the payment has to be sufficient so that Medicaid beneficiaries have equal access to care in the place where they live to other people. So what is sufficient payment? States really run around on that one. And when they're feeling flush, when we're in a boom time, they will pay more robustly and shore up their Medicaid program. And when we're in a recession like the one now, one of the first things that states look to balance their budget is to cut what they pay healthcare providers in Medicaid. So that's actually on the states. When you want to talk about Medicaid, you need to ask which state and what does their policy look like, because that's state legislators that make those decisions.
Makes a lot of sense.
And then how do we get past this? With the ACA, we've got this impression that it was that it's all the left, the progressives that want universal health care. But the universal health care is a very old idea. So how do we get ourselves back to this common ground of just everyone? I remember, back during the Reagan era, and where they were talking about if we didn't figure out health care, it was going to bankrupt the country eventually. And that was a Republican idea. That was a Republican talking point. And now it's just like the idea of having some kind of universal health care, some kind of way of taking care of everyone, so they're not always going to the emergency room when they need something, is like this radical idea. How do we bridge that gap again? I feel like we're just getting it's like it broke in the middle, and now the continents are floating apart.
If I had the answer to that question, I would be a multi-millionaire by now.
I was hoping it wasn't that simple.
The history is long, right? This is more than 100 years war in the United States. We can point to Chancellor Bismarck in Germany in the late 1800s, who started with this concept of universal health insurance coverage because workers were better able to work if they had their medical costs covered, right? It was very utilitarian. And so sometimes people make utilitarian and economic arguments for why we should have universal coverage, right? Because people can be better participants in society in all of its dimensions if they're covered well, right? So you could come at it from that perspective. Teddy Roosevelt picked up on that idea and ran with it, but it floundered. And then of course, FDR picked up with it and ran with it. And when he advocated for the Social Security Act in the 1930s, he wanted it to include medical coverage.
Right.
But to put a fine point on it, if I may, part of the pushback was from Southern Democrats who didn't want poor Black citizens to get those things from the federal government because they were afraid that desegregation would occur.
Right.
And that is frankly poison at the roots of our tree. And it is very hard to get away from that. And so when the Social Security Act was first enacted, it excluded agricultural and domestic workers because that was the grand compromise. When we look at a law like the Hill-Burton program that was created by President Truman, which is the program that created a huge number of the hospitals in the United States after World War II, Hill-Burton allowed hospitals to be segregated. And in fact, it was written into the law that they could be segregated hospitals built separately. And of course, they were separate and very not equal, right? It took Medicare, this in combination with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to desegregate hospitals in the United States. And those two laws made it so that we finally desegregated hospitals. But of course, that also meant that, for example, some of the rural Black hospitals closed, and those communities never got a new hospital. So when we think about the struggle in rural areas and the struggle for certain vulnerable communities, there are really deep roots to what our health landscape looks like right now.
And even with desegregated hospitals, it doesn't also mean that people are getting the same treatment, because I think there's been a lot of studies that show that patients of different backgrounds and ethnicities are prescribed things differently, they're treated differently, they're believed by doctors differently. So that's an ongoing thing as well. And I would feel remiss not to bring this up just in the midst of all the current events, you know, since you are, in addition to health law, you deal with ethics and human rights. I mean, between coronavirus of disproportionately affecting people in lower income areas, the ACA being possibly on the table to be removed with a new Supreme Court justice, as well as Roe v. Wade. I mean, these are all talk about ethics and human rights. I mean, we're at the crux of a lot of these things, or a crossroads, I should say, a lot of these things right now. And let's say if some of these things get struck down by the Supreme Court, is there recourse? Can there be further lawsuits, or that's it? It's over. It's done until some brand new case comes up.
How much time do we have?
2 minutes or less, please.
It just depends on how much time you have. So, I have a few questions as well. So.
Yeah, it really is how much time you have, honestly.
So we are at a bit of a crossroads. It is certainly fair to say that between COVID highlighting how vulnerable Black and Brown communities are, not only in terms of how they're treated differently in healthcare, but also in terms of the jobs that they hold, whether or not they're likely to have health insurance coverage, the kind of income that they have, the kind of resources they have, the gap in wealth between Black and white families, right? All of these things that are contributing to the deep despair that is unnecessary in communities of color right now. Also highlighted, of course, by the Black Lives Matter movement and its resurgence over the summer. It's not new, right? It's been around for a few years, but suddenly has recaptured everybody's attention because there are so many ways in which it's so clear that this is all important. I agree with you. I think we're at a crossroads. And it is very hard to know where anybody's going to turn when you hit a crossroads, right? So for a long time, the Supreme Court has been used as a tool for achieving recognition of rights, particularly civil rights or individual rights. In the United States, we tend not to use the language of human rights very much, frankly. The United States is notoriously reluctant to sign many of the multilateral treaties that craft the regime of human rights. We have signed but not ratified a variety of multilateral treaties, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the basis for the human right to health. And so we are behind as a nation. And in part, it's because we assert American exceptionalism, right? Oh, well, our Constitution covers that, so don't worry about us. We don't need to abide by those treaties, is sort of the common story, right? And of course, that isn't really true. I mean, there are dimensions in which our Constitution is absolutely unique and worthy of study, and we can have a different conversation about that. But to stay on point here, when legislators, when the political branches have been slow to act, many have looked to the courts for justice. And there have been, well understood strategies on the part of people like Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who ultimately made it to the Supreme Court, who facilitated an understanding of equality and of individual rights that was itself universal in much the way that human rights are meant to be. Because you're a human, you have certain rights. That's what human rights are. And if we have a court with a different balance, which we are very likely to have if Judge Barrett is confirmed, and it looks like she will be, then there are a number of health-related questions that are certainly up for grabs. As it pertains to California versus Texas, the case that's before the Supreme Court this term, this is, we've all lost track. It may be the 9th or 10th time that the ACA makes it to the Supreme Court.
I thought it was like 14 or something.
Yeah, I think it's 10, but this is the third challenge to the entirety of the law, and the second major constitutional challenge to the law. But legal scholars of all stripes agree that it is not a reasonable interpretation of the law to say that the entire law should be struck down if one part of it fails. So that's really what's at stake in this case. Even if Congress can no longer exercise its taxing power to have an individual mandate because the tax has been zeroed out, that is the penalty for not carrying health insurance coverage, there is another 900 some pages to the law that does all kinds of things. It makes it so that young people up to age 26 can stay on their parents' insurance. It makes it so that people who are in Medicare have lower cost drugs so that the donut hole doesn't exist and they don't run out of coverage for their pharmaceuticals. It makes it so that Medicaid expansion exists. It makes it so that we have a special public health fund that is supposed to help us in times like this when we have a pandemic going on, right? There are a number of things that the law does, in addition to the things we talked about earlier, protecting people with pre-existing conditions, guaranteed issue, all of those changes in commercial insurance, right? And it is not usual for a court to rule that a law of this size should be entirely struck down because one piece of it is problematic. So this is the issue that is called severability. Is the statute severable?
Excuse me, what's the piece that they say is problematic? Is it the individual mandate that Trump keeps touting? What is the individual mandate exactly?
So the individual mandate is the requirement in the ACA that everyone has to carry what's called minimum essential coverage. That's the law, the language of the law.
Like if you have a driver's license, you need an auto insurance.
Exactly. And
so it makes sense. It just, when people hear it in a rhetoric, why should I have to pay?
That's right. Yeah. And so individual mandate is not actually the language of the law. It is the political language surrounding it. And it has captured the public imagination because nobody likes to be told what to do in the United States. We're very individualistic, right? So the Supreme Court, in its first major decision on the ACA, the one that was issued in 2012, held that the individual mandate was an appropriate exercise of Congress's taxing power because there was a $700 penalty attached to, and there's more to it than that, but there was a multi-$100 penalty, maybe more, attached to not having health insurance coverage. And the way that it was described was if a person chooses not to carry health insurance, then they can be penalized with this tax penalty, right? And we use taxes to incentivize or de-incentivize all kinds of behaviors, whether it is a tax on tobacco products so that people won't smoke, whether it's tax benefits for having children, right? We use taxes for all kinds of policy purposes. And so the court said that's really not that big of a deal for Congress to make that decision that it can use its taxing power to influence people to buy health insurance. But now the tax has been zeroed. It is literally says zero instead of $695.
When did that happen?
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the end of 2017 was the let me not use jargon, was the law that Congress passed to make it so that the tax penalty would be zeroed out. So while the individual mandate, so-called individual mandate, is still part of the ACA, if you don't carry health insurance coverage, there is now a $0 tax penalty for not carrying health insurance coverage. So the challengers, Texas and 18 other state AGs and 2 state governors, have decided to challenge the constitutionality of the ACA in its entirety by claiming if you can't have an individual mandate, then all the other parts of the law have to fall too, because all of the changes in commercial insurance coverage depend on people buying insurance when they're not sick. That's their argument. And they say, and because that's so key to the law, everything else has to go too. So they claim the entire law has to fail.
I thought once the Supreme Court makes a ruling, that ruling stands as almost as if it was law. How do they keep getting, these cases back to the Supreme Court? Is it just a lot of dark money going there? Is it a lot of, who's funding all these different,
So there is a lot of funding going into
Start thinking.
dark thinking.
So to be clear, the Supreme Court can only decide the case that's in front of it. And so when the Supreme Court first heard the challenge to the constitutionality of the ACA, it was a challenge to the constitutionality of the individual mandate, challenging Congress's ability to create the individual mandate under 2 of its powers, the commerce power and the taxing power. There was a challenge to the constitutionality of Medicaid expansion under the spending power. This is a different challenge in that the law has changed. Now there is a $0 penalty. And so therefore the tax analysis that applied the first time around arguably doesn't apply this time because there is a change in the law. But let me make something else about this a little bit clearer, which is that the law is severable because Congress has said it's severable and because the Supreme Court has said it's severable. So 2 things about that. Congress in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act obviously decided that the law is severable because it severed one piece of the law from the remainder of the law. So there is really no question mark there as to what Congress intended. But then, of course, with the first decision that I mentioned in 2012 from the Supreme Court, the court had to decide what to do with its decision as to whether or not the entire law would fail if one piece of it was unconstitutional. And the court decided that the law was severable by saying states can decide whether or not to expand Medicaid and not striking down the entirety of the law. So there is no question mark over severability, but this is the issue that's been raised by Texas and the other states. And the Department of Justice, after going back and forth on a couple of different theories of the case, has ultimately settled on not supporting the case. Not supporting the ACA, but rather supporting the challengers in the case.
Why is it that like the new rhetoric from the far left is Medicare for all? Like, is that the only option for universal healthcare that we have? Because I feel like there are a few flaws in Medicare in itself, but I feel like universal healthcare is a way more, it's an easier sell to the population.
Yeah, so I actually read about this in a paper where I quote, do you remember The Princess Bride? Remember Vizzini? That word does not mean what you think it means, right? So when people say Medicare, I think they mean a lot of different things. And I think what it is, and Bernie Sanders was pretty transparent about this actually when he first started using this phrasing. They are trying to build on the political popularity of Medicare. Medicare is almost a political third rail, right? Nobody wants to touch Medicare because everybody wants to make sure that the nation's elderly are protected. And so Medicare for all is really a political catchphrase, but not an accurate phrase for what these bills would truly do.
Because that scares doctors and dentists, because I know Medicare doesn't really pay as much as regular insurance, which pays 2 or 3 times more than what, some of these services cost sometimes.
Yeah, dentists are their own thing. Dentists like being a cash business and have successfully lobbied to largely not be part of commercial health insurance. So
You have to opt in, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to point out, regardless of if someone takes a libertarian standpoint of, you can't tell me that I have to buy something or I have to pay for insurance. Does strike me kind of funny because both classic sort of portrayals of someone really right-leaning who is against it. One is somebody who's already paying for their own health insurance anyway, and is actually paying more for people who are uninsured, like you said, that have to inevitably get covered out of state money or however that people who show up at an emergency room. And so they actually are paying, they're subsidizing the people who are uninsured. And for the people who are, very low income, but are, more libertarian leaning and don't want, hey, you can't tell me what I have to do. They're actually getting a much cheaper way of being covered. Whereas something catastrophic happens to them, their entire family could lose their home, go into debt. It seems crazy to me, regardless of even legality, just from a sheerly logical standpoint, that people don't stop and think about the real financial implications of not being of a majority or a large number of people not being covered.
It would be economically disastrous if most people did not have health insurance, because statistically speaking, 98% of people need healthcare within the 5-year period. So you can't assume people aren't going to need care.
I also think there's a philosophy, a philosophical argument from the idea that I work hard, so I take care of myself, and I don't need the government to help me out. But at the same time, the money that you're not allowing to help people of your same strata, it usually ends up going back to somebody who doesn't need it. That we end up wasting money by allowing it to stay either misused in our taxes or the taxes that big corporations don't pay or health companies don't pay. And but we have there's this I work really hard idea, so I'm too proud to take any help, so you end up not helping other people. And I think that's kind of the thing that I feel like we have to break down, maybe with the history lesson that we were talking about earlier, of how the actual system works and why it's the way it is. And, that it was the doctors that lobbied the hardest against universal health care back in the 40s so that they, so they weren't going to lose any money. But the regular people out there, it just, sometimes they vote against themselves, and it boggles the mind.
I think to your point, it is very hard to understand exactly what everyone is getting in terms of support for example, purchasing health insurance coverage. Because as I said earlier, with employer-sponsored insurance, a lot of the federal financial support is hidden, right? It's hidden through tax subsidies or through tax exemptions. So people don't realize they would be paying but for. And so redistributive tax policy is a particularly tricky thing to talk about with people because it's quite complex, and it's very hard to boil it down and make it so that people understand that usually in most places where people in the United States pay federal taxes, for every dollar that gets paid in by the state, they get $2-3 back from the federal government. And people tend not to realize that, except for sort of the wealthy cities and the coast, most people are getting back much more than they put in.
Well, thank you very much. I know we've kept you a little long here. We really, really appreciate it.
Very good for me. That was a lot of information that I really needed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to meet all of you.
Same here. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, take good care.
You too.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Carl.
Bye-bye.
All right, everybody. That's all for episode 4. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive on healthcare. We hope you learned something. I sure learned a lot, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Until then, stay safe and keep your mind in tune.